Hello, everyone. So the last several videos that I have done have been on population genetic groups, where I covered the mixed race ones like the mulattoes, the Eurasians, and the Blasians, and I've also covered East Eurasians and Sub-Saharan Africans more recently. So that just leaves me with covering West Eurasians. So before we get into anything else, we need to define or write down what it is. Restorations is a broad anthropological slash population genetics umbrella for peoples whose deep ancestry clusters in Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of South and Central Asia. It's not a race in the everyday sense. It's a macro ancestral grouping based on shared prehistoric population history. So when it comes to the big picture regarding their breakdown, they descend largely from a mix of Upper Paleolithic West Eurasian hunter-gatherers, Neolithic farmers from Anatolia and the Fertile Crescent, and the steppe pastoralists, a la Yamnaya related. Different regions in the West Eurasian groups have different proportions of these layers. So now it's time for us to get into the clusters. I might go into more detail regarding some of the sub clusters, or I might just bring them up as small bullet points, but we're going to get into the clusters. And obviously, the biggest and the one most associated with this group all the way around are Europeans. This is very simple. These are people who are from or descend from Europe, hence it being the most western part of Eurasia and West Eurasia overall. So we do have Northern Europeans, which consists of the likes of Scandinavians, Germans, British, and Baltic people who have high steppe ancestry, plus European hunter-gatherers. The Northwestern Europeans are usually seen as the whitest of the white. When you think of all the socio-political and racial elements of it, they're seen as the most white and the standard. We could go into all of that another time, though. The next subcluster are Southern Europeans, which includes Italians, Greeks, Iberians, and Balkan people, as they have more Neolithic Anatolian farmer ancestry, kind of tying them more to Western Asia, but they still have a decent amount of steppe and European hunter-gatherer ancestry. And then the third cluster, or the subcluster, are Eastern Europeans, which consists of Slavs and some Finnish populations. So this group is very, very, very steppe heavy, and there is some East Eurasian input and admixture in specific groups, but it's usually within a small amount. So the next cluster consists of Middle Easterners, otherwise known as West Asians. So this cluster includes Levantines, which involves Palestinians, Lebanese, Syrians, and Jordanians, Arabian Peninsula population, so people in Saudi Arabia, Oman, Yemen, that area, Anatolians, which are modern day Turkish people, or sorry, Anatolians was the older term for modern Turkish people. Iranians slash Persians at the very end, or the east end of this, and the Kurds. So when it comes to key traits, they have high, very high Neolithic farmer ancestry, which is also what Southern Europeans have. So that's what ties the two groups together, though Middle Easterners have a lot more of it. There is some African admixture in coastal and southern regions, hence them being closer to the Horn of Africa and Eastern Africa. So I'm assuming some of that is from there, and a lot of that might come from the slave trade all around. And then the Iranian slash Caucasus groups also have distinct ancient components like CHG slash Iran N. So the next cluster are North Africans, and this includes Amazigh slash Berber population, so the indigenous North Africans, and more Arabized North Africans, so people from Morocco to Egypt who have a lot more Arab ancestry. So when it comes to their ancestry mix, they have indigenous North African ancestry, or they have that component, which is named the Ibero-Maurusian. Hopefully, I say that correctly. So that's the main base of their ancestry. Then there's a West Eurasian Neolithic farmer ancestry, which came from Anatolia. And there's also a sub-Saharan African admixture, which varies all throughout North Africa, though the admixture is higher in southern North Africa by the Sahara, which makes sense. It's closer to sub-Saharan Africa. Overall, they cluster genetically closer to West Eurasians than sub-Saharan Africans, which is why they are included and aren't associated with the sub-Saharan African genetic gene pool overall, or in mass, if that makes sense. So the next cluster consists of Caucasus people, which include people from the Caucasus, which includes Armenians, Georgians, Chechens, hopefully it's said correctly, Circassians, and Dagestani populations. They are a distinctive group for their high Caucasus hunter-gatherer CHG ancestry, and they are also huge contributors and important contributors to the steppe population. So their ancestry traveled deep into Europe via the steppe ancestry, and they are often genetically seen as an in-between land and an in-between variance between Europe and the Middle East, as well as their population. So I hope that all kind of just makes sense. Now I'm going to talk about groups who are sometimes included in this cluster, or there are some populations within their cluster that fits in with the West Eurasian group. So the first one is South Asian, as many South Asians are admixed, but the West Eurasian portion is very substantial in their admixture and ancestry. So the key components to South Asian are ancient North Indian, otherwise known as ANI, which is the West Eurasian related ancestry and genome of theirs, and the ASI, which stands for Ancestral South Indian, which is the indigenous South Asian. So groups with higher West Asian ancestry are North Indian, Pakistani, and some Upper Caste and Indo-Aryan speaking groups, as they have more of the West Eurasian related ancient North Indian ancestry and less of the ancestral South Indian ancestry. This is why South Asians sometimes cluster partially with West Eurasians in genetic studies. So the second partial group are Central Asians, which includes Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Turkmens, so it varies with that group too. These populations are often West Eurasian plus East Eurasian mix, though the variance is up and down, and they're often culturally Turkic but genetically very diverse. Okay, so now we need to get into what West Eurasians are not. So they are not the same as quote unquote white in a social sense, though there's some debate there when you look at the historical elements. It's not just limited to Europe. It is not a clean biological boundary, and it's not uniform in appearance. It's a deep ancestry category, not a cultural or political identity. Why does the term get used? So it's used based on population genetics, ancient DNA studies, and explaining migration patterns like the Neolithic, Indo-European spread, and also avoiding outdated racial labels. So, like the last two videos, I'm going to cover the genetic versus cultural elements of West Eurasians. So, when it comes to the genetic West Eurasians, this is the clean part. So, in population genetics, West Eurasians are people whose deep ancestry clusters with ancient populations from Europe, the Middle East, otherwise known as West Asia, North Africa, the Caucasus, and parts of South and Central Asia. What actually defines them genetically? So, not skin color, not language or culture, but shared ancient components. So, these shared ancient components are Anatolian Neolithic farmers, Caucasus, Iran Neolithic populations, European hunter gatherers, and steppe pastoralists, i.e., Yamnaya related groups. So, this is why a Lebanese Christian, a Sicilian, and an Iranian can cluster closer to each other genetically than to neighboring quote unquote racial groups. North Africans sit closer to Southern Europeans than West Africans. South Asians partially cluster with US Eurasians despite looking non white. Genetics see gradients, not boxes. So, B, cultural restoration. So, this is the messy part. Culturally, there is absolutely no unified West Eurasian identity. Languages. West Eurasians speak unrelated language families like Indo European, which includes English, Spanish, Persian, and Hindi, Afro Asiatic, which includes Arabic, Hebrew, Amharic, Kartvelan, which includes Georgian, Uralic, which includes some other European languages, and Turkic, which includes Turks, Azeris, who are culturally West Asian, though linguistically Central Asian. Language does not equal genetics. Religion. So there's so many religions that many West Eurasians are a part of. There's Christianity, which includes Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant. Islam, which includes Sunni, Shia, and Ibadi. There is Judaism. There is Zoroastrianism. Then there's secularism. So religious boundaries often cross genetic similarities, and this goes for any and every single group. Culture and self-identification. A Greek and a Lebanese may share more genetic ancestry than either shares with a Nigerian or a Japanese person. Yet culturally, they are treated as completely separate civilizations. So culturally, West Eurasians is simply useless. Okay, so how this or why this maps poorly onto race, census, and identity politics. So the first thing is race, which is a social system, not a genetic one. So the core problem is that race systems prioritize appearance, enforces hierarchies, and are historically contingent. Genetics measures ancestry, not status. So you can find overlaps and climbs within genetics, and it has no interest in quote unquote who counts as white. The results? Many West Eurasians are genetically closer to Europeans, but racially excluded from whiteness. Examples: Arabs, Iranians, North Africans, and some South Asians. B. Census systems, especially in the US. So the US census is political, not scientific. The infamous Middle Eastern North African problem. Middle Eastern and North African populations are genetically West Eurasians but are classified as white in the US, while often being racialized as non white. This creates contradictions. They are legally white, socially brown, and politically marginalized, hence the push for a Middle Eastern North African category. Honestly, I do think a lot of this was kind of brought upon themselves because they wanted to be legally classified as white for certain benefits. They were granted that, but then assuming 9/11 changed a lot of that, I could go further and further into this topic on another day. Maybe I will, but yeah. So we're going to continue this conversation with Latin America, which complicates things further. So in Latin America, white often means European culture plus European phenotype. Indigenous plus African ancestry is also foregrounded. West Eurasian ancestry via Iberians is normalized and somewhat invisible as well, but it's very acknowledged, and it's something that they kind of pushed emphasis on over the other two. It's kind of weird, actually. So, a mestizo Mexican man with 40 to 60% West Eurasian ancestry is not considered white, while a Lebanese Argentine often is. That's culture and class, not genetics. C, identity politics. So here's where it really breaks down. So competing incentives. Some groups emphasize West Eurasian genetic proximity to claim a whiteness. So this is where the Latinos and the Middle Eastern North Africans fit in. Others reject whiteness due to colonial or racial oppression, and others do this as well. And sometimes it can be the same people doing the last point and this point at the same time, which just makes it confusing. Some use genetics defensively against racial exclusion, and others reject genetics as irrelevant to lived experiences. So, no one is wrong, they're just answering different questions. So, why can't genetics just settle identity debates? So, genetics cannot tell you who was colonized, who was enslaved, who faces police profiling, and who benefits from racial privilege. Two people can be genetically similar and live radically different racial lives, especially if you're living in locations that are different, or if the two people are in one location and then they go to another location and have different experiences. So now we're going to move on to whitening, mestizaje, and honorary whiteness. So West Eurasian ancestry has historically been used to justify whitening ideology. So this is where West Eurasian and whiteness is tied together, and how population groups are ranked. So Europeans are higher than Middle Eastern people, who are higher than Indigenous people, who are higher than African, and it creates flexible racial boundaries. So here are some examples. So Southern Europeans were once excluded from whiteness. Levity tried to be reclassified as white in U.S. courts. North Africans are treated as white or black depending on the context. Genetics becomes a tool after politics, not before. So the bottom line is genetically, West Eurasians are a real, coherent macro ancestral cluster. Culturally, they share almost nothing universal. Racially, they are split, redefined, reclassified based on power. Politically, the term is either ignored or selectively used. Emphasis on selectively used, which is why West Eurasian is scientifically useful and socially explosive. Alrighty, so I kind of want to compare the quote unquote West Eurasian versus quote unquote white as a racial category. So I wanted to make those comparisons. So essentially, with West Eurasian versus white, it's the same people but different logistics, essentially. So we have to first break down what each category is. West Eurasian is a scientific slash population genetic category, which is based on shared deep ancestry from prehistoric populations in Europe, West Asia, North Africa, the Caucasus, and parts of South and Central Asia. So the logic behind this involves clines, admixture, and probabilities, with the goal being to explain human migration and ancestry. So overall, restoration answers what ancient populations contributed to your genome, where white is a social slash political category. The basis of it is on phenotype plus history plus power. The logic involves inclusion slash exclusion, mainly exclusion of others, while the goal is to maintain a social hierarchy. White answers where do you sit in a racial order? So the boundaries are kind of fuzzy versus the policed, or whether they're fuzzy versus policed. So when it comes to the West Eurasian boundaries, there's gradual transitions, there's no sharp edges, it overlaps with neighboring populations, which makes sense because they had to interact a lot, and there's no official membership. So Tajik is partially West Eurasian, Punjabi is partially West Eurasian, whereas African is West Eurasian with African admixture. There's no contradiction with any of these statements. White racial boundaries, or with white racial boundaries, it is actively enforced, it is changed by time and place, it is based on visibility and politics, and is often retroactive. So, an Irish person was once not white, a Syrian was legally argued into whiteness, a Latino can be white on paper and non-white in practice. Contradiction is built in. So, who fits one but not the other? So, West Eurasian but not white, socially. So, we have Arabs, which includes Levantine, Gulf, North African people, Iranians, Armenians, so there's context dependent on this. Many Jews, many South Asians, and North Africans. So, they're all genetically close, but it doesn't mean that they are racially accepted. So, who is white but not fully West Eurasian? Some Latin Americans with limited European ancestry, some self identified white with significant non West Eurasian admixture. Historically, people classified white through law, not ancestry. Race does not require genetic coherence. Another element to it that I want to discuss is the skin color, whether it's central or incidental. So, with West Eurasian genetics, skin tone varies widely as light skin evolved multiple times throughout history, and there are darker skinned West Eurasians that exist naturally. So, some Middle Eastern, North African populations, and some South Asian populations. Heck, there's even some Southern Europeans that are darker. There is no phenotype requirement when it comes to skin tone genetics and the variants within it. So, with white racial logic, light skin is foundational, which automatically X's out certain West Eurasians. Darker skin triggers suspicion or exclusion. Colorism polices borders internally. This is why a pale Iranian may quote unquote pass, but a dark Greek may not. And a blonde North African confuses racial logic in this regard. So now I'm going to move on to the census and bureaucracy. When it comes to genetics, it doesn't care about census boxes, national borders, or legal status. White in census in the US means different things. So, Middle Eastern, North African people are legally white, but they're socially not treated as white. In Europe, race is often avoided and ethnicity is used and preferred instead. In Latin America, whiteness is tied to class, culture, and proximity to Europe. So, West Eurasian ancestry is invisible here unless it is politically convenient. So overall, or the sixth point is that the power is the real divider. This is the core difference. West Eurasian is descriptive, non-hierarchical, and explanatory, while white is normative, hierarchical, and exclusionary. If whiteness was about ancestry, Iranians would be white, Arabs would be white, and many South Asians would be partially white. They aren't because whiteness isn't about ancestry. So why people conflate them and why it's risky. So the confusion happens due to early racial science trying to map Caucasian onto Europeans. Modern DNA tests resurrect old ideals with new language. People use genetics defensively or aspirationally. The danger is that genetics gets weaponized to claim status, race gets biologized again, social inequality gets naturalized. Restoration becomes a backdoor way of saying scientifically white, so it isn't. The bottom line, restoration is about where your ancestors came from, and it's real in genetics, but it's morally neutral. White is about who gets privilege, it's real in society, and it's morally loaded. They overlap by accident, not by design. So now I want to talk about the common phenotypes that restorations share, and there are some overlap, but others aren't as accurate. So we're going to kind of break this down by the strongest overlap when it comes to phenotypical traits to the weakest overlap between West Eurasians and white people. So the first and strongest overlap is the facial bone structure. So this is where genetics shows up most consistently. So the common tendencies have narrower to medium nasal bridges, but wide nostrils still somewhat exist. A high nasal root, especially in Europe, Iran, and the Caucasus, orthokinetic to mildly prognathic faces, and relatively narrow midfaces, again, on average. Why this matters, facial structure varies less than skin tone across breast duration, so that's the biggest key point there. This is why darker skinned West Eurasians can still read as European adjacent due to their facial phenotype. Two, hair texture. So the shared range is from straight to wavy to loosely curly. So essentially from type 1 to type C or maybe 3A, arguably 3B, but mainly 3A hair. Fine to medium thickness, most common. Coarse, tightly coiled hair is rare but not impossible. This overlaps heavily with whiteness standards, but it doesn't define them. Three, eye shape. So common patterns are deep set eyes, visible upper eyelid crease, moderate eye aperture width. So this contrasts with East Asian epicanthtic folds. The folds do exist in West Eurasians, especially in Central/South Asia. So the fourth one is beard growth, and obviously this is specifically focused on men. So they have a higher average facial hair density and earlier onset of beard growth. This trait cuts across Europeans, Middle Easterns, and South Asians and is often read as quote unquote white or Mediterranean in Western contexts. And five is skin tone range, but not the direction. So this is where people get it wrong. The shared reality is that West Eurasians span from very pale to deep brown. Whiteness selects only the lighter end of this range, so that's the contradiction there. Important note. Light skin does not equal restoration, as we have many lighter East Eurasians, and darker skin doesn't equal non-West Eurasian, since there are darker West Eurasians. So, Southern Italians, Levantines, North Africans, and many South Asians sit well outside the quote unquote white ideal skin tone wise, but they're still inside the West Eurasian genetic cluster. So, why do these traits not map cleanly? So, one, overlap with non West Eurasians. Many traits above also appear in Horn of Africa populations, some East Africans, some Central Asians, and some indigenous Americans due to ancient shared history and some admixture with all those groups technically. Phenotype does not equal ancestry. Two, whitening filters the spectrum. Whiteness doesn't reflect average restoration appearance. It reflects Northern and Western European subsets, class filtered phenotypes, and colonial beauty standards. So white looking doesn't equal representative. And like I just mentioned, it's heavily focused on the Northern and Western European phenotype. And three, there's selection bias. People notice that people notice the West Eurasians who do fit whiteness and they actively ignore the ones who don't. This creates an illusion of a tight phenotype. So what they don't share, despite popular belief, they do not share uniform light skin, they don't share blue/green eyes, they don't share blonde hair, they don't share narrow noses across the board, and they don't share one European face. These are regional European traits, not West Eurasian defaults. So that concludes my West Eurasian video. This concludes this series that I've done on the three ancient anthropological quote unquote racial groups that are monoracial and mixed race. So that's now over. I might go into more specifics about certain groups of people in like the restoration group, certain groups of people in the sub-Saharan African group, certain people in the mulatto group, examples like that. So I might go into specific groups of people within these six groups of people that I've discussed. But yeah, thank you for following me on this journey, and I'll be back with more content. Take care soon.